Fuzz was telling you about all the problems with Jurassic Park. Let me share you some more. There's no way T-Rex can chase a Jeep at 45 miles an hour. And my sons, they'd say, Dad, when we're watching science fiction, we don't want to know how many times the laws of physics are being violated. But those movies violate the laws of physics all over the place because the laws of physics tell us you can't have an animal bigger than an elephant without water support. The era of the dinosaurs was an era where there were large, shallow seas over the continents. And so you had 10, 15, 20 feet of water that gave sufficient water buoyancy that you could have animals that big. So next time you see a Jurassic Park movie, realize that T-Rex was probably moving in water and not very fast. And it wasn't worried about lawyers in a Jeep. It was really more interested in the big herbivorous dinosaurs that are out there that it could use. So, now, there are some science fiction movies I actually do like, even though they violate the laws of physics everywhere. I did enjoy watching Interstellar with my sons. Even though it completely violated all known physics, the equations in the background were all correct. So, that really warmed my heart. Well, once again, I want to remind you that, yes, we are giving away 2 free ebooks. Genesis 1, A Scientific Perspective, Darwinian Evolution that Fuzz talked about. Scan that QR code. But I've been asked to address the question, are we alone in the universe? What about the possibility of extraterrestrial life? Where do UFO'S fit in? And we're not supposed to use that acronym anymore. It's now UAPs. Unidentified anomalous phenomena. So I'll try to use UAPs for the rest of my talk. But are we indeed alone? Now it's interesting, Christians have been debating this subject for 2,000 years. And we had theologians, Christian theologians on both sides of the fence. Literally for 2,000 years. You can read this in the writings of the early church fathers. Now, the core of the debate was some of these theologians said, look at Psalm 104. I know that's one of your favorite Psalms, Fuzz. And what you see in Psalm 104 is God packing our planet with as much life as possible, as diverse as possible. And you get to sense the joy that God has in creating when you read Psalm 104. And theologians have looked at that and said, God seems to really enjoy creating. And Fuzz said, we're like that too. We enjoy creating. He enjoys creating so much, there's no way he would stop at one planet. There's got to be life everywhere within the universe. But then we have theologians on the other side saying, well, when we look at the Gospels, we notice that Jesus frequently refused to perform miracles. And they developed a theology that God conserves his miracles. He only performs those miracles that are necessary to achieve his ultimate purpose. And if his ultimate purpose is redeeming billions of humans from their sin and evil, well, he only needs one planet. And so they argue that we are alone. So this is a debate that's been going on for thousands of years. Where the theologians have made some progress is when you read Hebrews 9 and 10, it says Jesus died one time, one place for all. And so some theologians have looked at that and said, well, maybe we could have grass on another planet. Maybe we can even have dolphins on another planet, but not beings like us that are spiritual, that are in need of redemption. Although in the 21st century, some theologians have pushed back on that and said, it's possible we could have beings like us on another planet that are sinful and in need of redemption, but they got the technology to have kind of a TV set vision of what Jesus did 2,000 years ago here on planet Earth. So they said, if we imagine sophisticated theology, we could actually have the equivalent of human beings on other planets as well. Now, one reason why there's been a big push to saying ET has got to be out there is we now realize the universe is really big. As I mentioned this morning, we're looking at 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. And each of those galaxies has 1 to 200 billion stars. And each star typically has several planets orbiting it. That's a lot of planets. well, we're talking a good 10 trillion planets in the universe. And they said, why would God make all those planets and have them all empty except for one? That doesn't make any sense. But as you heard me explain this morning, is that you actually need a universe of precisely the mass that we observe, no more, no less, to get one planet on which life can exist. So yes, the fact that there are 2 trillion galaxies doesn't argue against the fact that we may indeed be alone. And everywhere we astronomers look beyond planet Earth, we see conditions that are hostile for life. And so Neil deGrasse Tyson was caught in an outtake once where he said, the universe is out to kill us. It's a deadly place. Everywhere we go, it's trying to wipe us out. The exception being planet Earth. But he is making a valid point. Everywhere we astronomers look, we see extremely hostile conditions for life. And for life to exist, we need to be living in a very specially designed cluster of galaxies, a supercluster of galaxies, a galaxy, our star. I mean, my peers have been searching for 70 years to try to find a star sufficiently like the sun that it could be a candidate to have a planet orbiting it in which advanced life exists. Now, I got my graduate degree, my PhD in astronomy, with a bunch of my fellow graduate students who wound up becoming leaders in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligent life. But I've been engaging them saying, you're focusing on planets that look a lot like Earth. Well, they don't really look like Earth. Venus is still the most Earth-like planet we've found anywhere in the universe. But they're focusing their radio telescopes, trying to listen to signals from these planets. I said, it's a lot easier to determine the characteristics of the host star than it is the planet. Stars are bright, they're easy to measure, and we've yet to find a single star. So it's like, I think you're wasting valuable telescope time on planets we already know are non-candidates for the existence of advanced life. And I love what Senator William Proxmire said decades ago. We need to stop funding SETI. It's difficult enough to find intelligent life in Washington. Why are we trying to find it elsewhere in the universe? I knew that would play well here in West Virginia. Now, the most common explanation, by the way, the Bible does tell us that there is ET. When you read the Bible, it declares that there are 3 distinct kinds of intelligent life. One that has always existed, namely the Creator God, and 2 species of intelligent beings that He has created, the angels and us human beings. And the difference is this: we humans are intelligent, physical, soulish, and spiritual, but we're constrained by the physics of the universe. We can move and operate within the universe, but not beyond. The angels also are intelligent and spiritual, but God has given them the power to come into our realm or leave our realm, but they also live in a distinct realm. Now, humans are constrained by the laws of physics. The angels are not. Now, the most common explanation for UFOs is that we're being visited by aliens like ourselves, beings like ourselves, traveling to us in spaceships, and that's the most frequent encounter. Today, we can definitively establish that is not the case. It's simply not possible for beings like us to traverse interstellar space. And how we've discovered this is thanks to an idea that Elon Musk passed on to the astronomers. He says, we're looking at these planets through these telescopes, but wouldn't it be great to actually send a spaceship to a planet outside of the solar system and get more detailed information? There's a limitation of what we can learn from telescopes, even as powerful as the James Webb Space Telescope. And so astronomers picked up on that idea and said, yes, let's actually send spaceships to the nearest planet outside of our solar system. It's not that far away. It's only 4.2 light years, but keep in mind a light year is 6 trillion miles, so it is a significant distance. And they said, in order to get there in any reasonable period of time, we need to send it at at a fraction of the speed of light. Now, one thing I've learned in speaking to audiences around the world, people don't know F equals ma, but they do know E equals mc squared. It's the one equation everybody in the world seems to know. And c is the velocity of light. Now, what that means is the faster you travel through interstellar space, the more damage your spaceship will take from the particles that exist in interstellar space. Interstellar space is not a vacuum. You've got at least one proton for every cubic meter. It doesn't seem like much, but when you're moving at a high velocity, it can do significant damage. And the c squared tells you that, for example, if you go 2/10 the velocity of light instead of 1/10 the velocity of light, your spaceship will suffer 4 times the damage. If you go 3/10 the velocity of light instead of 1/10, you get 9 times the damage to your spaceship. And so astronomers have determined, at best, we can't go faster than 10% the velocity of light. Otherwise, the spaceship gets destroyed. And even at 10% the velocity of light, the biggest spaceship that could possibly make the journey is about this big, 10 centimeters across. Because the bigger the cross-section of the spaceship, the more damage it's going to take from the particles that are there. And so we now realize if we're going to pull this off, we got to send tiny spaceships. And we got to send a lot of them. And so astronomers actually have a plan that they want you to fund with your tax dollars, which is to send 1,000 spaceships this big to the nearest planet outside of our solar system. And the reason why we want to send 1,000, we know that at least half of them will be totally destroyed before they get there, even at just 1/10 the velocity of light. But the remaining half will only be partly destroyed, and they'll be partly destroyed in different ways, and we got a good chance of getting some useful information back. Now, the funding of this is going to be problematic, because at 1/10 the velocity of light, it's going to take 42 years to get there. And it's going to take 4.2 years to get a signal sent back to planet Earth. So this is a 50-year project. And congressmen are elected for 2 years, senators are elected for 6. I mean, this is going to be a hard sell. But it is doable. And astronomers are trying to persuade you, the taxpayer, saying, we found a way to make these tiny spaceships quite powerful in terms of their technology, and we can do it fairly cheaply. It's a lot cheaper to make a tiny spaceship than it is to make a really big spaceship. So send them there. But the bottom line is this. There's no way beings our size are ever going to traverse interstellar space. Matter of fact, you can't put a termite inside that spaceship. It won't make it. You can't even put a bacterium in that spaceship. It'll be destroyed not only by the particles that it's encountering, it'll be destroyed by the radiation, because you're now exposed to 42 years of radiation. And with a spaceship that tiny, there's no way that you can insulate or protect a microbe on board. And so this has actually been a powerful proof against panspermia. You know, one of the explanations for the origin of life on planet Earth, that is some microbe on a distant planetary system, got wafted over interstellar space, landed on Earth, and that's the origin of life. But this spaceship project has basically told us that can't possibly work. Life originated on Earth, it was created on Earth. We didn't get life transported from another planetary system. So the panspermia model, and what's wonderful about that, the people who've been pushing panspermia have basically been arguing there's no way life can originate on planet Earth unless you got some engineer that's pulling it off, as Fuzz has said, some very skilled biochemist, God himself would have to do it. I love the fact that the people pushing naturalistic origin of life on Earth are able to refute the panspermia model, and the people pushing the panspermia model are able to refute the model of the origin of life, which leaves us with only one possible explanation. God must have done it here on planet Earth. Now, I did not become an expert on UFOs on purpose. It was totally by accident. And the accident was this. You heard my story that I became passionate about studying astronomy when I was 7 years of age. And Fuzz made mention that I was collecting pop bottles and going to the store and getting 2 cents a pop bottle. But you got 5 cents? I only got 2 cents for a pop bottle. So I had to collect thousands of pop bottles to get enough money where I could buy a telescope mirror. And then with my dad's help, I built a telescope. And so during my early teens, I began a project to observe T-Tauri stars. And I wound up being appointed the director of observations for Vancouver's Astronomical Society at age 16. And I said, okay, we need to try to recruit more people to help us look at these stars, variable stars. I wanted to recruit more people to do the observations. And so we had a booth at the Pacific National Exhibition. And it was wonderful because a lot of our members wanted help grinding their telescope mirrors. So we put all these mirrors out on our exhibit table, and we invited people to come by and say, hey, why don't you try your hand at grinding it? And so with hundreds of people grinding it, we got really nice polished mirrors. So we had an ulterior motive, but here's the problem. They put our booth right next to the Flying Saucer Club. So people would go to the Flying Saucer Club booth, talk to them, then they would come to us, usually me, and say, what do you think about this? And so what happened was every time I went on to a university, they said, hey, you were an amateur astronomer before becoming a professional. You know the night sky. You get to handle all the UFO reports that come in. And I've had some really interesting experiences. I remember being on a telescope one night and getting a call from the police, and they said, we're investigating a UFO. Can you help us out? And I said, yeah, describe what you're doing. And I heard them in the background saying, we're gaining on it. But as they continued to describe what they were doing, it says, well, I don't think you're going to catch it because you're chasing the planet Venus. And so they broke off their chase. So, but what I've discovered is that I could explain 99% of what people reported as being UFOs or UAPs. Either as a natural phenomena, like Venus is a bright morning star. By the way, you've never had that experience when Venus is way brighter in the morning than it is the evening. In the morning, like at 4 o'clock in the morning, it can be so bright you can read a newspaper by its light. And when people see it, they think they're seeing a UFO. But more common than Venus is people reporting, hey, I've seen this UFO, and it turns out just to be a fireball. Now, a fireball is a spectacular experience. A fireball is a meteor or a shooting star in the atmosphere where the diameter of the shooting star becomes bigger than 1/4 the diameter of the moon. So it's big and bright, and it can leave a smoke trail. It can change directions. You can hear a sound. And so that was a lot of the UFO reports I processed. But I can tell you personally, I've seen fireballs that were 4 times the diameter of the moon. They can really be quite a spectacular sight. The ones to watch out for are the ones that get bigger and bigger and bigger and don't move. If that happens, you need to run in a perpendicular direction at a high velocity because it's coming towards you. So, and then there were those that were hoaxes. I mean, at the University of British Columbia, we had several UFO flaps that were generated by the Undergraduate Engineering Society, where students would send up balloons on purpose in formation and get them to ignite, and then watch all the reports in the newspaper the next day. Or what happened to us when I was doing radio astronomy research, there was this is back in the 1960s, where there was this very fast-moving object coming through the sky, and it stopped right over our radio telescope and hovered, and it was causing radio interference. And the telescope I was using was close to the NORAD headquarters, so we called them and said, hey, we know you got some sophisticated aircraft. Please tell your pilots they can look, but they need to turn their radios off. They said, we don't have anything like that. I says, oh, well, would it be okay if we report to the Ottawa newspapers what we were seeing? They said, no, don't do that. We'll make sure nothing happens near your radio telescope. And the point being is that there is secret military activity going on. But the bottom line is, I could explain 99% of what people reported to me as UAPs. But there was a 1% residual that didn't fall into that category. Now, this is a phenomenon that's been going on for thousands of years. It's not new. Thutmose III in his annals reported seeing a UFO. And it's all throughout history. What is different is how they appear. But for example, we now have over 2,000 documented cases where multiple observers will see a UAP going through the atmosphere. And when you've got multiple observers, you can determine the velocity of this UAP. And we're talking velocities in excess of 5,000 miles per hour. But the human observers never report a sonic boom. They never report any heat friction behind the object. If we're talking a physical object, you will get a sonic boom. I mean, I've heard the space shuttle go through the atmosphere. You hear two loud sonic booms, and you see a huge heat trail behind the space shuttle. In no case where people have observed these UFOs going through the atmosphere, UAPs, pardon me, do you see any heat friction or hear a sonic boom. And we're talking here about ones that go through the atmosphere and hit the ground. And you go to the crash site, what do you see? You see a crater as much as 18 inches deep. So a crater. And vegetation is always damaged. If there's snow, the snow is melted. But as you investigate the crater site, you can't find any debris or any artifacts. Now, we all know when an airplane or a helicopter crashes into the earth, there's stuff that's there that you can recover. In the case of these UAPs, there's nothing to recover. But we know that something's happening. Something made that crater. Something melted the snow. Something damaged the vegetation. And so, of the 7 physicists that have written books on this subject and have spent at least 10 years studying this UAP phenomena, they all agree with the French astrophysicist Jacques Vallée. He's done the most research of all, and he's written multiple books on this. He says, we're dealing with something that's interdimensional. He's basically making the concession. We're dealing with something that is real, but it's not physical. If it's real and not physical, it can't be part of our dimensions. It can't be part of our physics. Now, I took a short course from Carl Sagan when I was at the University of Toronto, and the subject of these UFOs came up, and he totally dismissed it. But what I noticed was because he was an atheist, he denied the existence of non-physical reality. And therefore he said, there can't be any truth to this UAP phenomena. But here's the problem. Worldwide, we're looking at over 30 million reports of UAPs that fall into this 1% category. Yes, it's just 1%, but we're talking over 30 million instances. This is not a small database. As I mentioned, over 2,000 crash sites where you can actually see a crater and damaged vegetation. We really are dealing with something that is non-physical but real. It also explains the latest reports that we're getting from our government. Our government is now, and it's not just the US, the French government, the British government, even the Russian government has been releasing classified information in the last 2 or 3 years on this UAP phenomena. And what you see in that phenomena is that you've got pilots reporting that they see a UAP zipping at thousands of miles an hour and then turning a sharp right-angle turn. No physical object can do that. The G-forces would tear it apart. And yet this is commonly reported. They also report that sometimes they can see it on a radar screen, and they can see it visually, but the camera doesn't pick it up. So you've got multiple detection devices. Some pick it up and some don't. If it's a physical object, they would all pick it up. And of course, I think you're all aware that when you do see a photograph, the photograph is always a little bit blurry. If we're talking a real object, it will sometimes be sharp, sometimes be blurry. In fact, when I was in Tennessee last week, I was on the Blurry Creatures podcast. Maybe you've heard of that podcast, but they were asking me about Bigfoot. I said, well, you're asking the right guy. I was raised in British Columbia, and that was the birth of Sasquatch, which became Bigfoot. And I said, I'll tell you how it got all started. There was an engineering student that weighed 300 pounds and was 6'8", and they created a nice Bigfoot outfit for him, and they made shoes for him that were 2 feet long, 2.5 feet long, and had him tramp around the snow north of Vancouver. But the engineering student said, I won't do this. unless you surround me with students that make sure no hunters take a shot at me. And of course, they took several blurry photos of them. They made sure that none of the photos were really sharp. But that's an example of a hoax. So what we're really dealing with is something that's non-physical and real. And it was Alan Hynek, an American astrophysicist in the 1960s, who was commissioned to head up Project Blue Book, which was a project funded by the U.S. federal government to investigate the UFO phenomena, what we now call UAPs. And he was the one that said the most interesting instances of these UAPs that are non-physical but real are the close encounters. And so he came up with the term close encounters. And there's been movies like Close Encounters of the First Kind, Second Kind, Third Kind. A close encounter of the first kind is where the human contactee is 500 feet or less away from the UFO phenomena. A close encounter of the second kind is where they actually have some contact, where the human contactee says, I can see some kind of being that's associated with the UAP. And then close encounters of the third and fourth kind is where there's communication going on. And typically what happens is the human contactee goes into a trance-like state. And there's even an example where a human contactee went into a trance-like state where they were actually engaging in automatic writing, which means they're in a trance, but they were typing away on a computer. And this, in one case, what came out was a 4,000-page book. So we're talking a really significant close encounter where the fellow went into a trance over many, many days and produced this book. What's interesting about the book is that it's the core Bible of 4 different UFO religions. In the United States, there's multiple UFO religions. I guess they're going to have to call them UAP religions now. But 4 of them, the 4 biggest ones, are all founded on this 4,000-page book. It's called the Urantia book. You can Google it and see what it's all about. But Wikipedia will not really get you into the content of the book. What I find fascinating about that book is 1/3 of the content of the book is denying the deity of Jesus Christ. Now, one thing that Alan Hynek did point out, first encounters, close encounters of the first kind, second kind, third kind, he says was close encounters of the 5th kind. A close encounter of the 5th kind is where the human contactee suffers significant physical injury and in some cases even death. There's reports where the animals associated with the human being are killed or injured, and in cases, and basically he said, the best you're going to come away with a close encounter is recurring terrifying nightmares. Now, back in the late 1980s, I was invited to go to the Soviet Union to speak. Interesting project. I was funded by the Soviet lab. They actually covered all my expenses while I was there in the Soviet Union and Ukraine. And I said, well, you know I'm a Christian. This is an atheist nation. What's going on here? And he says, well, if we catch you sharing your Christian faith with anyone who doesn't have a doctoral degree in science or engineering, we'll immediately deport you. You'll never be invited back. But he says, you're giving me the freedom to speak to people with these doctoral degrees. He says, yes. They go to international conferences. We brought you over here to appease them. They want lectures on God and science and stuff. I said, okay. And he said, by the way, you don't get to pick the lectures they pick. They had me come up with a list of 30 lectures that I could give. But what was interesting, 60% of the lectures that my audiences wanted me to deliver were on UFOs. Mainly because many of them were experiencing these UFO encounters. And this was a time when the Soviet Union knew that they were behind the technology of the West. We in the West thought that they were just as good as we were. But when I got there, I got to see, hey, this is not an advanced nation. I mean, for example, I said, hey, can I have an overhead projector to help me in my talk? They said, we don't have overhead projectors. And I said, okay, can I use these blackboards? They said, our blackboards don't work. And I said, what about the chalk? Our chalk doesn't work either. Says, we do have a microphone. That's the best we can give you. And so I had to give all my talks just with a microphone, no blackboard, no visuals, nothing. So, but what I noted was that their physics departments all had a department of occult physics. They knew they couldn't compete with the West technologically, but they thought they could get a leg up on the West by doing research on occult physics. And one of the things that we've discovered at Reasons to Believe, we have a book on this called Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. And what's unique about our book on UFOs, UAPs, is that we claim it's a scientifically testable explanation of the UFO phenomena. Namely, that when you talk about the close encounters, we argue the only people that have these encounters are those that have been involved in the occult. And if they get the occult out of their life, that's the end of the UFO encounters. But we make the point that those nations in the world where you have a high percentage of the people involved in the occult, you also have a high percentage of people claiming to have these close encounters with UFOs. So there's a good reason why the Soviet Union, there was so many people having these close encounters, because the occult was a big factor in the life of the Soviet Union. I went back there in 1994 when the communists were no longer running the show, and the level of close encounters had dropped by more than an order of magnitude, because now there was way less people in the population involved in the occult. So that's basically the bottom line that we have in Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. These phenomena occur to people that are involved in the occult, and they don't. I got to see this personally as an observational astronomer. I mean, during my graduate school time, I was logging 1,500 hours on the telescope every year. But I remember there were 2 astronomers that would come up for a 3-hour observing run once a year. And every time they had an encounter with a UFO while they're on the telescope. But I knew that these 2 astronomers were deeply involved in the occult. They were having those encounters because of the occult, not because of the observing time. And there were 3 of us graduate students who were all logging 1,500 hours a year or more. We never had a UFO encounter. And the significant part of that is statistics show that the most common occurrence site for a UFO encounter is 3 a.m. in the morning on a lonely country road. Well, where do astronomers hang out? 3 a.m. in the morning on lonely country roads. That's where all of our telescopes are. And yet very few astronomers report having encounters with UFOs. The only ones I know personally who've had these encounters are people who are deeply involved in the occult. Well, this tells us the origin of the UFO phenomena. It's angels that are interdimensional. They're not confined to our dimensions. And so when Jacques Vallée, an agnostic, says we're dealing with interdimensional beings, that's what I would say, hey, you're right, we are dealing with interdimensional beings. The Bible describes these beings as fallen angels. And when you look at the close encounters, even though we're talking millions of close encounters with these UFOs, not one person testifies of a beneficial experience. It's always deleterious. The best you come away with is recurring, terrifying nightmares. The worst case is your relationships are destroyed in your families and with your friends. You can even get a personal injury. People have been, they actually experience insanity. So it's always deleterious. It's never harmful. The other thing we notice is that the messages we get from these so-called UFO beings is always one of deception. I've already reported. What we get is the Urantia book, which seems focused. And what's interesting about the messages you get from these UFO beings, they don't seem to worry about the God of Islam or the God of Hinduism or the God of Buddhism. It's all focused on the God of the Bible and trying to deny the existence or the operation of the God of the Bible. We would expect that from the fallen angels. We'd also expect that as fallen angels, given their message. And what we notice is they keep pace with our technology, and they keep pace with the lay-level knowledge of astronomy. So, for example, what we see 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the UFOs were slow-moving dirigibles in the atmosphere. moving at no more than 100 miles an hour. You get to World War II, what you have are the fighter pilots reporting encounters with Foo Fighters. What they were seeing outside of their aircraft were these other objects moving at the speed of sound. Then we move into the 21st century. They're moving as fast as our fastest spaceships, 26,000 miles an hour. They seem to be keeping pace with our technology. They're also keeping pace with lay-level knowledge of astronomy. You go back 120 years ago, they would report, hey, we're from the backside of the moon. But when the general public became aware, well, the backside of the moon is not a very pleasant place to live, they said, well, we're from Venus. And when people became aware of how hot it is on the surface of Venus, they changed their story and said, we're from Mars. Then when people became aware nowhere in the solar system is it possible for beings like us to live, they said we're from another planetary system. I'm wondering what's going to happen when the general public realizes we astronomers have yet to find a single planetary system outside of our own where any kind of intelligent life would be possible. What story are they going to tell then? But the fact that they keep changing their story and the fact that they keep pace with our technology is symptomatic that they have a deceptive motive. And the Bible tells us that the fallen angels, the demons, are out to deceive us. And their main project is to get us to terminate our life before we give our life to Jesus Christ, or to get us to believe something other than the Christian message. And when I say terminate your life, that is a factor we see in close encounters of the third, fourth, and fifth kind. People become so terrified that they wind up taking their own life. And the demon wins, because the demon has now got a human being to terminate their life before they give their life to Jesus Christ. But the bottom line is, this is scientifically testable. Get the occult out of your life, that'll be the end of your UFO encounters. But start dabbling in the occult, and don't be surprised if you start having these kinds of encounters. Which is why we close our book off by saying, because one thing I've noticed about Americans, my wife and I did a college briefing where we had 400 college students for a weekend, and these were college students from Christian homes. And so we did a survey with them about the occult and found that 1/3 of the women in this college briefing audience had dabbled in the occult and weren't even aware of it. And with the men, it was less. It was about 1/5 of the guys had been involved in the occult and weren't aware of it. With the guys, it was typically video games that had an occult connection that they were completely ignorant about. What I noticed with the college gals, often they would have like a sleepover and they would bring out a Ouija board and dabble around with that. I had no idea, hey, when you do that, you're basically inviting a fallen angel to come into your life and give you power. And what we notice in these games, whether it be video games or Ouija boards or a seance, the demon is more than willing to give you secret information or power in trade for you giving up the truth. And so this is something you see in Scripture. We're always to put a higher priority on truth than we are in any kind of power that we might be granted. And as Jesus himself said, the demons are capable of miracles. Therefore, we're to test the spirits to see whether this is of God, the righteous angels, or the evil angels. But in terms of what we're seeing here in America, my experience in speaking on this and as a pastor is there's a lot of ignorance about the occult. And I think that's one of the responsibilities of the church. We need to be teaching our people, and especially our children and our youth, about the dangers of the occult. And when you read the Old Testament, notice how much instruction is in the Old Testament. Avoid astrology, or avoid fortune tellers, avoid seances, avoid any dabblement in the occult at all. Now, sometimes this happens innocently. There was a couple in our church who gave me a phone call and said, we just purchased a home. But one of the things we noticed is there was one room in the home where the temperature was about 10 degrees colder than the other rooms. And I said, well, that's unusual. That's out of the ordinary. And they said, yes. And we go into that room, objects move. And I said, what kind of objects? And they said, well, there was a spoon that was floating in midair. And I said, okay, there's something going on here. And they said, yeah, we know. There's something going on here. And I said, And they said, we've already searched through the house because we figured the previous owners had left behind some kind of occult article. They even went to the neighbors, and the neighbors said, yes, that room, it was painted midnight blue, and teenage boys there were holding seances. So they kind of knew something was going on. But they had me come over, and they said, we need to find the object. I remember going into the room, and you actually could see that it had been painted over, and underneath you could see that midnight blue paint, a favorite color for seances. Then I saw a faint octagonal outline on the wall. And I said, we need to find that. They said, we've already searched the house. I said, well, let's take a half hour and pray that God will reveal to us where this article exists. And after the article, we started walking through the house, and I said, have you looked in the garage? Yeah, we looked in the garage. I said, I want to go in the garage. Went in the garage, and there was a pile of junk lumber on the rafters at the top of the garage. I said, have you looked there? And they said, no. Well, we spent about 30 minutes pulling all that junk lumber down. In the middle of it was this octagonal astrological forecaster. We destroyed it. The room went back to normal. No more floating spoons. No more scary feelings when you entered the room. Everything went back to normal. I'm just saying that because sometimes it might not be you involved in the occult. It might be a previous owner of your possession that was involved in the occult. And there was a young man that came to me and said, look, I'm having these encounters with UFOs, but there's nothing in the occult in my life. And I said, well, what about your father? He said, no, not my father, not my grandfather, our whole family, nothing. And I said, well, what kind of relationship are you in right now? And he says, well, I'm having sex with a witch. And I said, I think that's your connection. And that just gives you an example of the naivete of some people. And I said, did you ever think, because it tells us in the Bible, when you have sexual intercourse with a person, you become one with that person. So he broke off the relationship, and that was the end of his UFO encounters. But again, just a word of encouragement to you leaders here in the church. We in America have been naive. It's time to guard ourselves, because after all, where do the demons want to really target their attacks? On the church. If they can mess up the church, they got the rest of the country. So we need to be on our guard. Thank you.